Montana Territory, 1872. The sky stretched endless above the rolling plains, indifferent to the lone figure who rode beneath it. Owen Alderson guided his horse along the ridge overlooking the valley, his eyes scanning the horizon with the wariness of a man who had learned never to let down his guard. At 25, his face still carried youth's smoothness, though weathered by sun and wind. His strong jaw, straight nose, and clear blue eyes might have been handsome if not for the hardness that had settled there, a protective shell against a world that had taught him cruel lessons. The war had ended 7 years ago, but Owen still carried it inside him. He'd been just 18 when he joined up, believing in glory and returning a different man. The bloodshed had hollowed something in him, and the years since, drifting from ranch to ranch as a hired gun and cowhand, had only reinforced what he now held as truth. Attachment was weakness, and in this untamed country, weakness got you killed. His latest employment had brought him to the Circle M Ranch, where Old Man Miller had hired him to help protect his herd from the rustlers plaguing the territory. The position suited Owen fine. He could ride alone, sleep under stars that asked nothing of him, and keep the human connections that had betrayed him so often at arm's length. A man needs nothing but his horse, his gun, and enough sense to keep moving, he muttered to his mount, a dapple-gray gelding named Thunder. The horse's ears flicked back at his voice, the only company Owen allowed himself these days. As the last rays of sunlight filtered through the pines, Owen spotted a thin column of smoke rising from the valley below. Miller had mentioned no other hands would be out this far. Trouble, perhaps. His hand instinctively moved to the Colt revolver at his hip as he urged Thunder down the slope. What he found was not the band of rustlers he'd anticipated, but a single wagon, its wheel broken and listing to one side. A small campfire flickered nearby, and beside it sat a young woman. She looked up at his approach, her face illuminated by the dancing flames, and Owen felt something he hadn't in years, a moment of genuine surprise. She stood as he dismounted, revealing herself to be of medium height, with a posture that spoke of both proper upbringing and quiet determination. Her dress, though travel-worn, was of good quality, a deep blue that complemented her fair skin. But it was her hair that caught the dying light, not simply blonde but the color of wheat fields at harvest, falling in gentle waves past her shoulders. "Good evening," she said, her voice steady despite finding herself face to face with an armed stranger at dusk. "I was beginning to wonder if anyone would come along this road today." Owen tipped his hat, keeping his distance. "Ma'am, you're a fair piece from anywhere safe." His eyes scanned the area looking for others. "You alone out here?" She nodded, gesturing to the wagon. "I was traveling to Silverwood to meet my uncle. The wheel gave out about 2 hours ago." She hesitated, then added, "I'm Grace Sutton, 20 years old and perfectly capable, but admittedly in need of assistance with that wheel." The directness caught Owen off guard. Most proper young ladies didn't introduce themselves so plainly to strange men on the frontier, but these weren't ordinary circumstances. "Owen Alderson. I work for the Circle M." He moved to inspect the wagon, grateful for the distraction from her clear green eyes that seemed to see more than he cared to reveal. "This is no country for a woman alone." "Perhaps not," Grace replied, following him to the wagon. "But circumstances don't always allow for ideal arrangements. My father passed last month in Denver. My uncle is my only remaining family." The broken wheel was worse than he'd first thought. The axle had split as well, and no amount of trail repairs would make it roadworthy before morning. "You'll need a new axle," Owen said flatly. "Can't fix this tonight." Silverwood's still 15 miles north. Grace's shoulders seemed to sag slightly, but she quickly composed herself. "I see. Well, I have provisions and a bedroll. I suppose one more night under the stars won't be the end of the world." Owen frowned. "There's been rustlers in these parts, desperate men who wouldn't think twice about." He stopped himself, uncomfortable with finishing the thought. "It ain't safe." "What do you suggest, Mr. Alderson?" "I can hardly walk to town." The sensible thing would be to leave her with some ammunition, advice to keep her fire small, and ride for help. Getting involved was precisely what Owen had promised himself he'd avoid. People complicated matters, they made demands, they expected things, they died. But even as these thoughts crossed his mind, he knew he couldn't leave a young woman alone in a territory where law was still more aspiration than reality. It violated what little remained of his code. "I'll stay until first light," he said gruffly. Then I'll take you to Silverwood myself. Grace's expression softened with relief. Thank you, Mr. Alderson. I promise not to be a burden. Owen, he corrected, unsure why he'd offered his first name. Just Owen is fine. As night fully claimed the sky, they sat on opposite sides of the fire. Grace had offered to share her provisions, salt pork and biscuits that were surprisingly tasty, and Owen had contributed coffee from his saddlebags. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken questions. Have you been in Montana long? Grace finally asked, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee. Long enough, Owen replied, then, feeling the inadequacy of his response, added, 5 years or so. Came north after the war. You fought. Owen nodded once, offering nothing more. Most people understood not to press further, but Grace Sutton was evidently not most people. My brother died at Antietam, she said quietly. Confederate ball took him. He was only 19. Owen stared into the flames, memories he worked hard to suppress threatening to surface. Lost a lot of friends too, on both sides. Is that why you're out here? To get away from those memories. The directness of her question jarred him. Ma'am. Grace, she corrected with a small smile. Grace, he conceded. Out here, a man's business is his own. People don't tend to ask questions like that. Perhaps they should, she replied, unfazed by his rebuff. Perhaps that's why so many men out here look as though they're carrying the weight of mountains on their shoulders. Owen shifted uncomfortably. Frontier life is hard, not much room for softness. Strength and softness aren't opposites, you know. Her gaze was steady across the flames. Sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is remain open despite what the world has done to them. Owen almost laughed at the naive sentiment. That kind of thinking gets people killed out here. And does your kind of thinking make you feel alive, Mr. Alderson? She asked quietly. The question hung between them, too pointed to dismiss, too true to answer. Owen stood abruptly. I'll check the perimeter. You should get some rest. He walked away from the fire, grateful for the darkness that hid whatever might have shown on his face. Morning came with the soft lavenders and pinks that made even the most hardened frontiersmen pause in appreciation. Owen had slept little, keeping watch through the night, his mind turning over Grace Sutton's words more than he cared to admit. She emerged from her small tent as the first rays of sunlight crested the eastern hills, her hair braided neatly and her face freshly washed. Despite a night in the wilderness, she carried herself with a dignity that spoke of inner strength rather than mere propriety. Good morning, she said, approaching where he stood by the rekindled fire. I hope you managed some rest. Enough, he answered, pouring coffee into a cup and offering it to her. We should head out soon if we want to reach Silverwood by midday. Grace accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks. What about my wagon, my belongings? I'll send someone from town to collect it. Not much choice unless you want to wait here another day or two for repairs. She considered this, then nodded. You're right, of course. I've imposed on your kindness enough already. It's not, Owen paused, uncomfortable with her characterization, just doing what needs doing. After a simple breakfast, Owen helped Grace gather her most essential belongings into a single trunk, which he secured to Thunder's saddle. The rest would have to wait for retrieval. Then came the matter of riding arrangements. You ever ridden double before? He asked, eyeing his horse dubiously. Not since I was a child, Grace admitted. But I'm sure I can manage. Owen hesitated, then extended his hand. It'll be easier if you sit in front. I'll balance the weight better. Grace placed her hand in his, small but not delicate, the hand of someone who knew work, and allowed him to help her onto the saddle. Owen swung up behind her, acutely aware of their proximity. He kept his arms extended around her to hold the reins, creating as much space between them as the arrangement allowed. Ready? He asked, his voice gruffer than intended. Yes, she replied simply. They rode in silence for the first mile, the rhythm of Thunder's hooves the only sound between them. Owen was hyper-conscious of Grace's straight back, careful not to let any part of him touch her unnecessarily. It had been years since he'd been this close to a woman, and longer still since one had affected his composure. May I ask you something, Owen? Grace's voice broke the silence. He tensed. Depends on the question. What keeps you in Montana? You don't seem particularly attached to it. The unexpected question took him by surprise. He'd anticipated more personal inquiries. "Land's still open here," he said after a moment. "A man can breathe without too many others crowding him. Once the railroads finish pushing through, that'll change." "Always does." "So you stay because there aren't many people?" She glanced over her shoulder, a hint of amusement in her eyes. "That doesn't sound like attachment, it sounds like avoidance." "Pretty forthright for someone I just met," Owen remarked, though without real anger. Grace turned forward again. "My father used to say I was born without the sense to keep my thoughts to myself. It served me poorly at times. And well at others. Perhaps. It's hard to know which is which until after the words are already spoken." A small creek crossed their path, and Owen guided Thunder carefully down the embankment. As they forded the shallow water, the horse stumbled slightly on a slick stone. Owen instinctively tightened his arm around Grace's waist to steady her. "I've got you," he said, the words escaping before he could consider them. "Yes," she replied softly. "It appears you do." When they reached the other side, Owen became aware that his arm still encircled her. He withdrew it as casually as possible, clearing his throat. "Should reach town within the hour," he said, focusing on the horizon. The incident at the creek had shifted something between them, a small crack in the careful distance Owen maintained. As they rode, Grace began to tell him about her life in Denver, where her father had been a moderately successful merchant. She spoke of books she loved, of her hopes to perhaps become a teacher once settled with her uncle. "What about you?" she asked eventually. "What did you want to be before the war changed everything?" Owen was silent for so long that Grace might have thought he hadn't heard, but finally he answered, "Thought I might have a ranch of my own someday. Small place, nothing fancy." "That sounds lovely," she said. "Why haven't you pursued it?" The simple question pierced deeper than she could know. Images flickered through Owen's mind, the farm in Pennsylvania he'd grown up on, his parents' faces, the letter he'd received during the war informing him they'd both succumbed to fever, the land sold to cover debts. "Takes money," he said shortly, "and roots." "You don't strike me as a drifter by nature, Owen Alderson," Grace said thoughtfully. "You strike me as someone who's afraid to stop moving." Before Owen could formulate a response, the first buildings of Silverwood came into view. The town had grown considerably in the 2 years since he'd last visited. New storefronts lined the main street, and construction was underway on what looked to be a proper hotel. "Where does your uncle live?" Owen asked, grateful for the change of subject. "He owns the general store," Grace replied, "Sutton's Mercantile." Owen nodded. He guided Thunder down the main street, aware of the curious glances from townspeople at the sight of a Cowhand riding double with a respectable-looking young woman. Grace, for her part, sat tall and composed, seemingly unbothered by the attention. Sutton's Mercantile occupied a prime corner lot, its freshly painted sign swinging gently in the breeze. As they dismounted, the store's door opened, and a stocky man with graying hair and a neat mustache emerged, his expression transforming from curiosity to delight. "Grace. Good heavens, we weren't expecting you for another 2 days." He hurried down the steps, arms outstretched. Grace embraced him warmly. "Uncle Howard, it's so good to see you. I would have arrived on schedule if not for a broken wheel. Mr. Alderson here was kind enough to bring me to town." Howard Sutton turned to Owen, extending his hand. "I'm much obliged to you, sir, very much obliged indeed." Owen shook the offered hand briefly. "No trouble, her wagon's about 10 miles south. Needs a new axle." "We'll send someone right away," Sutton assured him, then turned back to Grace. "Your aunt will be beside herself with joy. She's been preparing your room for weeks." As Grace and her uncle exchanged further greetings, Owen began untying her trunk from his saddle. The task complete, he cleared his throat. "Well, you're safe with your family now. I should be getting back." Grace turned from her uncle, something like disappointment flickering across her features. "You're leaving already? You've ridden all morning. Surely you could stay for a meal at least." "Got responsibilities back at the ranch," Owen said, adjusting his hat. "Miller's paying me to watch his herd, not escort ladies to town." "Then we must insist on compensating you for your time and trouble," Sutton said, reaching for his wallet. Owen held up a hand. "Not necessary, just doing what any man would." "Very few would, I think," Grace said quietly. "Thank you, Owen, truly." Something in her tone made him meet her eyes directly for perhaps the first time. The genuine warmth he found there was almost painful to witness. "Take care of yourself, Miss Sutton," he said, tipping his hat. He mounted Thunder in one fluid motion and turned the horse toward the edge of town, resisting the urge to look back. He'd done his duty. The girl was safe with her family. That should have been the end of it, another brief encounter in a life designed to avoid lasting connections. Yet as Owen rode south toward the Circle M, Grace Sutton's words echoed in his mind. "You strike me as someone who's afraid to stop moving." The observation had cut closer to the bone than he cared to admit. 2 weeks passed, and Owen threw himself into his work with even more dedication than usual. He took the longest patrols, volunteered for the night watches, and spoke even less than was his custom. If the other hands noticed his darker mood, they knew better than to mention it. On a supply run to a smaller settlement 15 miles from the ranch, Owen was surprised to hear a familiar voice call his name as he loaded provisions onto his packhorse. Mr. Alderson. What a pleasant surprise. He turned to find Grace Sutton standing on the boardwalk, a basket over her arm, her wheat gold hair partially covered by a modest bonnet that matched her sage green dress. The sight of her sent an unexpected jolt through him. "Miss Sutton," he greeted, touching the brim of his hat, "didn't expect to see you in these parts." She approached, smiling. "My aunt had some preserves to deliver to friends. I volunteered to bring them." She glanced at his laden horse. "Restocking for the ranch." Owen nodded. "Winter's coming, best to be prepared." "How have you been?" she asked, her tone suggesting genuine interest rather than mere politeness. "Fine," he replied automatically. "And you, settled in with your uncle?" "Yes, quite well. He's even offered me a position teaching at the school they're establishing." Her eyes brightened. "The town voted to fund it just last week." "Congratulations," Owen said, meaning it. "Sounds like you found your place quick enough." "Perhaps," she tilted her head slightly. "Though I still have much to learn about the territory." A pause, then. "I asked about you, at the mercantile." Owen stiffened. "That so? People speak highly of your skills with horses and tracking. Less so of your sociability." There was a teasing quality to her voice that somehow eased rather than increased his discomfort. "Not much for talk," he admitted. "So I gathered." She shifted her basket to her other arm. "Yet I found our conversations on the trail quite enlightening." Owen busied himself with checking the packhorse's straps. "Should be heading back soon, storm brewing." He nodded toward the western horizon where dark clouds were indeed gathering. "Before you go," Grace said quickly, "my uncle is hosting a harvest social at our home this Saturday. Nothing elaborate, just some music, food, and company to mark the season." She hesitated, then added, "I would be pleased if you would attend." The invitation caught him entirely off guard. "I don't do socials, Miss Sutton." "Have you ever tried, or do you simply assume they're not for you?" He frowned, uncomfortable with her persistent challenges to his carefully constructed boundaries. "Appreciate the thought, but—" "Just consider it," she interrupted gently. 8 o'clock, you know where to find us." Before he could formulate another refusal, she gave a small nod and continued down the street, leaving Owen with the distinct and unfamiliar feeling of having lost control of the encounter. The next few days passed in a fog of indecision that irritated Owen to no end. He'd spent years cultivating the ability to make clean, definitive choices, ride or stay, fight or flee, live or die. Yet here he was, turning a simple social invitation over in his mind like a lovesick boy. "You going somewhere special?" Miller asked on Saturday evening, eyeing Owen as he shaved carefully by the bunkhouse mirror, something he typically did only once a week. "Town business," Owen replied curtly. The older man raised an eyebrow but said nothing more, though the knowing look in his eyes suggested he wasn't fooled. Owen told himself he was going to Silverwood for supplies they'd forgotten, perhaps a drink at the saloon. The freshly laundered shirt and polished boots were merely practical. Town demanded better standards than ranch life. Yet as Thunder carried him toward Silverwood, he knew he was lying to himself. He arrived at the Sutton home just after 8, the sound of piano music and laughter drifting through the open windows. For a full 5 minutes he sat on Thunder, debating whether to continue or turn back before anyone noticed his presence. "Either go in or ride away, but make up your mind," he muttered to himself. Looking like a damn fool sitting here. With a deep breath, Owen dismounted, tied Thunder to the hitching post, and approached the front door. He'd raised his hand to knock when the door swung open, revealing Howard Sutton himself. Mr. Alderson, the older man's surprise quickly transformed into a welcoming smile. Grace mentioned she'd invited you, but I must admit I doubted we'd have the pleasure. Owen shifted uncomfortably. Wasn't sure myself until I got here. Well, I'm glad you decided to join us. Come in, come in. Sutton ushered him inside, taking his hat. Grace will be delighted. The Sutton home was modest but well appointed, its parlor now rearranged to accommodate about 20 guests. A woman played piano in the corner, while small clusters of Silverwood's residents conversed over drinks and plates of food. Owen immediately felt out of place. He knew no one except the Suttons, and his usual haunts involved considerably fewer doilies and painted teacups. "Owen, you came." Grace's voice cut through his discomfort. She approached from across the room, her face alight with genuine pleasure. She wore a dress of deep burgundy that complemented her fair complexion, her hair arranged in an elegant style that somehow maintained the natural softness he remembered. "Said I'd consider it," he replied, attempting casualness despite the way his pulse had quickened at the sight of her. "And I'm very glad you did." She gestured toward a quiet corner. "Let me introduce you to some people. Unless you'd prefer refreshment first." "Introductions are fine," he said, though in truth he'd rather have faced a gunslinger than a room full of social niceties. Grace seemed to sense his discomfort. As she led him through the gathering, she kept the introductions brief and focused on common ground. A rancher who'd also served in the war, the blacksmith who'd repaired her wagon, a widow whose son was considering cowhand work. "You're good at that," Owen observed when they finally had a moment alone, each holding a plate of food. "At what?" she asked, genuinely curious. "Making connections, putting folks at ease." She smiled. "I've moved often enough in my life to learn the skill. My father's business took us to several cities before we settled in Denver." She studied him for a moment. "You're more at ease than you think, you know. You've been conversing quite naturally for the past half hour." Owen blinked, realizing she was right. While he'd been focusing on not embarrassing himself, he'd somehow managed several decent exchanges without the awkwardness he'd anticipated. "Different from what I'm used to," he admitted. "And is that entirely bad?" she asked, her green eyes holding his with that direct gaze that seemed to see right through his defenses. Before he could answer, the piano music shifted to a livelier tune, and several couples moved to the center of the room to dance. "Do you dance, Owen?" Grace asked, setting her plate aside. He shook his head quickly. "Not since before the war, and poorly then. Sometimes the things we've forgotten merely need a gentle reminder." She extended her hand. "I promise not to judge your footwork." Owen stared at her offered hand. Dancing meant closeness, touching, public display of a connection he wasn't sure he wanted acknowledged, even to himself. Yet he found himself setting his plate aside and accepting her hand. "Can't promise your toes will survive," he warned. Her laugh was warm and genuine. "I'll risk it." The dance was a simple one, thankfully, a pattern he vaguely remembered from his youth in Pennsylvania. Grace guided him subtly when needed, her hand light on his shoulder, her waist slender beneath his palm. As they moved together, something shifted in Owen's chest, a loosening of the tight coil he'd kept wound since the war. "See," Grace said softly, "not forgotten after all." The evening continued, and to Owen's surprise, he found himself relaxing incrementally. He spoke with the town doctor about the mare that had foaled at the Circle M last spring. He discussed timber prices with a carpenter building the new schoolhouse. He even managed a cordial exchange with the local banker, a man Owen would normally have avoided on principle. Throughout it all, Grace moved through the gathering with natural grace, attending to guests while somehow always remaining aware of him. She would appear at his side just as a conversation lagged, introduce a new topic or person, then drift away again, leaving him more integrated into the social fabric than he would have thought possible. As the evening wound down and guests began to depart, Owen found himself in no hurry to leave. He helped Howard Sutton move furniture back into place while Grace and her aunt, a kind-faced woman named Martha, collected dishes. "You've made quite an impression on my niece," Howard commented quietly as they repositioned a heavy sideboard. Owen's hands stilled momentarily. "Sir." "Grace has a good heart and a keen mind," the older man continued. She sees value where others might not look. It's a rare quality. He gave Owen an assessing look. She's mentioned your dream of having your own ranch someday. Owen felt strangely exposed. Just talk. Not much chance of it happening. Perhaps, perhaps not. Howard straightened, dusting his hands. I've been in business long enough to know opportunities often arise when least expected. The railroad's coming next spring. Land values will change. Some will rise, others fall. Owen frowned, uncertain where this conversation was leading. I appreciate the insight, Mr. Sutton, but I'm just a hired hand with more debts than dollars. For now, Howard agreed amiably, but a man's circumstances can change, Mr. Alderson, particularly when he has reason to want them to. Before Owen could respond, Grace returned from the kitchen. Uncle, Aunt Martha wants to know if, she stopped, noticing the serious expressions of both men. Have I interrupted something? Not at all, Howard assured her with a smile. Just man talk. If you'll excuse me, I should see what your aunt needs. He departed with a meaningful glance at Owen. You look as though someone's just delivered unsettling news, Grace observed, moving closer. Owen shook his head. Your uncle's an interesting man. He is indeed. She studied him for a moment. I'm glad you came tonight, Owen. I wasn't sure you would. Neither was I, he admitted. And now that you have, was it as terrible as you feared? The question prompted a small, genuine smile. No, not terrible at all. The moment stretched between them, filled with something Owen couldn't, or wouldn't, name. Grace was the first to break the silence. It's a beautiful night. Would you walk with me in the garden before you leave? I find I need some fresh air after all the festivities. The sensible part of Owen knew he should decline, make his excuses, and return to the safety of the ranch and his solitary existence. But that part was growing weaker by the hour in Grace Sutton's presence. Lead the way, he said instead. The Suttons' garden was small but well tended, with late-blooming flowers releasing their fragrance into the cool night air. A full moon silvered the landscape, casting long shadows and highlighting Grace's profile as she walked beside him. You've been in Silverwood almost a month now, Owen said when the silence between them grew too weighted. Is it what you expected? She considered the question. In some ways, it's certainly more developed than I anticipated. Uncle says it will be twice the size in a year once the railroad comes through. And will you stay and teach at the new school? I believe I will, she said, then added softly. I've always wanted to put down roots somewhere. To build something lasting. They reached a small wooden bench beneath an apple tree and sat, a respectable distance between them. What about you, Owen? Will you stay at the Circle M indefinitely? He gazed up at the stars, so bright and clear in the Montana sky. Never thought much beyond the next season. That's the Cowhand's way. But not what you want, Grace observed. Not really. What makes you so sure of that? Because when you spoke of having your own ranch, there was something in your voice, a longing you usually keep hidden. Owen fell silent, uncomfortable with her perception yet unable to deny it. Finally he said, wanting and having are different things. Yes, Grace agreed, but the distance between them is often shorter than we believe. She turned to face him directly. What are you afraid of, Owen Alderson? The blunt question caught him off guard. I'm not. You are, she interrupted gently. I see it in the way you hold yourself apart, in how carefully you guard your words and thoughts. Something taught you that connection was dangerous. Owen stood abruptly, moving a few paces away. His instinct was to leave, to retreat from this conversation that probed too close to truths he'd spent years burying. Yet he remained, his back to her, words rising unbidden. Lost my parents while I was fighting, came home to nothing, then lost friends in senseless ways out here, Indian raids, claim disputes, winter storms. He drew a deep breath. After a while, a man learns that caring just means more to mourn. He heard her soft footsteps as she approached, but didn't turn. I understand grief, Owen, I do. I've buried a brother, a mother, and a father. Her voice was close behind him now. But I cannot believe that emptiness is preferable to feeling, even when feeling brings pain. It's simpler, he said, barely above a whisper. Simpler, yes, but not fuller. Not truer, she moved around to face him, moonlight catching in her eyes. Not more alive. Something broke in Owen then. a dam he'd constructed stone by stone since the war, holding back emotions he'd deemed too dangerous to acknowledge. The tenderness in Grace's expression was almost more than he could bear. "I should go," he said roughly. She nodded slowly. "If that's what you truly want." But she made no move to lead him back to the house, instead standing before him in silent challenge. Owen knew the sensible choice, the safe choice. Return to the ranch, focus on work, forget Grace Sutton and her unsettling ability to see through his carefully constructed defenses. Instead, he heard himself ask, "Would you ride with me tomorrow? There's a place north of town, Miller's Bluff. You can see 3 valleys from the top." Her smile was like sunrise. "I would like that very much." The ride to Miller's Bluff the next afternoon marked a turning point that Owen only partly recognized as it was happening. Grace rode her uncle's gentle mare alongside Thunder, the two of them conversing with an ease that should have alarmed him, but instead felt like the most natural thing in the world. She told him of her childhood in Pennsylvania, not far, it turned out, from where he'd grown up, and her love of books, particularly the novels of Dickens and the poetry of Whitman. Owen found himself sharing memories he'd thought long buried. Fishing with his father in the creek that bordered their farm, his mother's apple pies cooling on the windowsill, the county fair where he'd won a blue ribbon for his calf. "I haven't thought about that in years," he admitted after recounting how he'd saved for months to buy his first hunting rifle. "Sometimes we lock away the good with the bad," Grace observed. "It feels safer, but we lose so much in the process." From the top of Miller's Bluff, the landscape unfurled before them in breathtaking majesty. Rolling hills giving way to distant mountains, the river snaking silver through the valley. "It's beautiful," Grace breathed, dismounting to stand at the edge. "Like something from a painting." Owen tied the horses to a nearby pine and joined her, seeing the familiar view through new eyes. "First time I came up here, I thought if I ever had land of my own, I'd want it to be somewhere like this, where a man could see the seasons change across the whole valley." Grace glanced at him. "That dream isn't beyond reach, you know." Uncle Howard mentioned several parcels of land being sold as the Perkins family moves back east. "Your uncle seems mighty interested in my future," Owen remarked, remembering their conversation the previous night. "He's a businessman. He sees potential investments." She paused, then added more softly, "And he cares about my happiness." The implication hung between them, too significant to ignore but too delicate to acknowledge directly. Instead, Owen gestured toward a flat rock bathed in sunlight. "Brought some food if you're hungry." They shared a simple meal of bread, cheese, and dried apples, conversation flowing more easily than Owen would have thought possible a month ago. As the afternoon waned, he found himself reluctant for their time together to end. "We should head back before dusk," he said eventually, though making no move to rise. Grace nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Owen, may I ask you something?" "You've never hesitated before," he replied, a hint of humor in his voice. She smiled briefly, then grew serious. "What happened during the war? What changed you so profoundly?" The question was like a physical blow. Owen stared out at the horizon, silence stretching between them. Just as Grace began to apologize for overstepping, he spoke. "We were in Virginia. Second day at Cold Harbor, my unit was ordered to charge a Confederate entrenchment." His voice was flat, detached. "We knew it was suicide. The ground was open, no cover for hundreds of yards. But orders were orders." He paused, the memories he'd suppressed for so long rising with terrible clarity. "Lost 70 men in less than 10 minutes. Friends I'd marched with since Pennsylvania, and for what? Nothing changed." The line didn't move an inch. His hands had clenched into fists without his realizing it. "That night I found my best friend's body, Jimmy Carr. We grew up together. He'd gotten engaged before we left, had the ring in his pocket to keep it safe." Grace was utterly still beside him, her eyes never leaving his face. "I wrote to his girl, told her he died a hero." Owen's laugh was hollow. "Truth was, he died scared and screaming for his mother in a muddy field for no good reason at all." He finally met her gaze. "That's when I knew. Caring is just an invitation for the world to show you how little anything matters." Grace reached out slowly, covering his clenched fist with her hand. "Thank you for telling me," she said simply. No platitudes, no attempt to explain away his pain or offer easy comfort. Something in her quiet acceptance broke through Owen's defenses more effectively than any argument could have. He turned his hand beneath hers, their fingers intertwining. They rode back to Silverwood in a companionable silence, the connection between them deeper for the truths they'd shared. At the edge of town, Owen hesitated. "I'd like to see you again," he said, the words feeling strange on his tongue after years of avoiding attachments. Grace's smile was warm. "I'd like that too, very much." Over the following weeks, Owen found himself drawn to Silverwood with increasing frequency. He and Grace rode together when weather permitted, exploring the surrounding countryside. On rainier days, they sat in her uncle's parlor, Grace reading aloud from her favorite books, while Owen discovered the pleasure of literature he'd abandoned after his schooling ended. Howard and Martha Sutton observed their growing attachment with approval, often finding reasons to leave the young couple alone while maintaining the proprieties. The town took notice as well, the solitary cowhand and the schoolteacher becoming a recognized pair at church services and community gatherings. For Owen, each day with Grace chipped away at the wall he'd built around his heart. Her laughter, her intelligence, her quiet strength in the face of her own losses, all combined to create a pull he no longer wished to resist. For the first time since the war, he began to think beyond the immediate future, to consider possibilities he'd long dismissed. On a crisp November afternoon, Owen rode into Silverwood with purpose, heading not for the Sutton home but for the bank. The meeting he'd arranged left him thoughtful but cautiously optimistic. His next stop was the Mercantile, where Howard Sutton greeted him warmly. "Owen, Grace mentioned you were bringing a hunting party from the Circle M into the mountains this week." "That's right," Owen confirmed. "Back in 4 days if the weather holds. Actually wanted to speak with you if you have a moment." Howard's eyebrows rose slightly, but he nodded, leading Owen to his small office at the back of the store. Once the door closed behind them, Owen removed his hat, turning it nervously in his hands. "Mr. Sutton, I've come to ask your blessing to court your niece properly." The older man's face broke into a broad smile. "I was wondering when we'd have this conversation." He extended his hand, which Owen shook with relief. "You have my blessing, son, though I suspect you already have Grace's heart regardless." "There's more," Owen continued, his expression serious. "I've just come from the bank. That parcel we discussed, the old Coleman place west of town, I've put a deposit on it." Howard's eyes widened. "That's a significant step." "Land's good, water rights solid, house needs work but it's sound." 500 acres to start." Owen met the older man's gaze directly. "I don't have much saved, but Miller's paying a bonus after we deliver the herd to the railroad next month. Bank's willing to finance the rest based on my reputation and your good word." "I see you've thought this through," Howard said, studying Owen carefully. "May I ask what prompted this decision?" Owen considered the question. "A month ago, Grace asked what I was afraid of. Truth is, I've been afraid of wanting anything too badly, of believing in a future." He paused. "Not anymore." Howard nodded slowly. "Life offers no guarantees, Owen. The frontier less than most places, but a man needs something to build toward, something beyond mere survival." "Yes, sir, that's what I've come to understand. And my niece has helped you reach this understanding." Owen smiled slightly. "She has a way of making a man see things differently." Howard chuckled. "That she does." He grew serious again. "She's had her share of sorrow, Owen. I would not see her heart broken." "Nor would I, sir," Owen replied firmly. "I can't promise an easy life, but I can promise to face whatever comes with her, not shield her from it." The older man nodded, apparently satisfied. "When do you intend to speak with her?" "When I return from this hunting trip. If things go well with the sale," Owen trailed off, not wanting to tempt fate by saying more. "I believe they will," Howard said, rising to indicate the meeting was concluded. "Safe journey, Owen. We'll look forward to your return." The hunting trip into the mountains was successful, though Owen found his thoughts constantly returning to Silverwood and the future he dared to imagine with Grace. The party was in high spirits as they headed back, their packhorses laden with venison and elk meat that would sustain the ranch through the coming winter. They were a day's ride from town when the first snowflakes began to fall, earlier than expected but not concerning. By nightfall, however, the gentle snowfall had transformed into a full blizzard, forcing them to make camp in a sheltered ravine. "This ain't good," Miller observed grimly as they huddled around a struggling fire. Storm like this could last days this time of year. Owen nodded, calculating distances and supplies. We've got food enough, shelter's the worry. Could make for the old mining cabin, suggested Peterson, another hand. Should be about 3 miles east, if I recall right. The decision was made to attempt reaching the cabin at first light. Owen slept fitfully, his dreams filled with swirling snow and Grace's face, worried and waiting. Morning brought no relief. The storm had intensified, snow now knee-deep and visibility limited to mere yards. They packed quickly, aware that their situation was becoming precarious. The journey to the cabin was grueling. Twice they lost their bearings completely, saved only by Owen's uncanny sense of direction. When the dark shape of the cabin finally emerged through the curtain of snow, all 4 men nearly wept with relief. The abandoned mining cabin was crude but solid, its stone fireplace intact. Within an hour they had a fire blazing and the horses sheltered in a lean-to against the cabin's leeward side. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault. "Reckon we're here for duration," Miller said, watching the snow pile against the single window. "Could be days before this lets up." Owen's jaw tightened. Grace would be expecting him back. The papers for the land purchase waited at the bank. For the first time in years, delay seemed intolerable. 3 days passed with no sign of the storm abating. They rationed their supplies carefully, melted snow for water, and took turns keeping the fire fed. On the morning of the 4th day, Owen woke to an unfamiliar sound, silence. The wind had stopped. He opened the cabin door to find a world transformed. 3 feet of pristine snow blanketed the landscape, glittering in the morning sun. The sky above was a clear, impossible blue. "We can make it back today," he announced to the others. "Storm's broken." Miller studied the snow doubtfully. "Be slow going, horses'll struggle." "Then we leave now," Owen said with a determination that brooked no argument. "Town's worried by now. No sense delaying further." The journey that should have taken hours stretched into a grueling day-long ordeal. The horses floundered in the deep snow, requiring the men to dismount frequently and break trail. By the time the lights of Silverwood appeared in the distance, night had fallen and temperatures were plummeting again. As they rode down the main street, Owen noticed an unusual number of people still about despite the late hour and bitter cold. Something was wrong. He dismounted outside the mercantile, surprised to find it still open, light spilling from its windows. Inside, a group of men were gathered around a map spread on the counter. Howard Sutton looked up as Owen entered, his face transforming from tension to shock. "Owen, thank God!" He rushed forward, gripping Owen's arms as if to confirm he was real. "We feared the worst when the storm hit." "Holed up in an old mining cabin," Owen explained, suddenly uneasy at the palpable relief in the room. "What's happening here?" Howard's expression shifted, worry returning. "It's Grace. She's missing." The world seemed to tilt beneath Owen's feet. "What, how?" 2 days ago, she insisted on riding to the school to secure some books before the worst of the storm. Should have been a simple journey, 20 minutes each way. Howard's voice was strained. "When she didn't return after an hour, we began searching. Found her horse halfway to the school, but no sign of Grace." "The storm was already heavy by then," added Sheriff Michaels, approaching from the group. "We organized search parties, but visibility was near zero. Been waiting for the weather to clear to make another attempt at first light." Cold dread settled in Owen's stomach. 2 days in this weather, alone and possibly injured. "Where exactly was the horse found?" he demanded, moving to the map on the counter. The sheriff pointed to a spot about a mile northeast of town. "Here, near the creek crossing." "Horse was spooked but uninjured." Owen studied the map intently, his mind racing. If Grace had been thrown, she would have sought shelter from the storm. The creek followed a ravine eastward, with several rock outcroppings that might offer protection. "I'm going now," he said, already turning toward the door. "Owen, it's night," Howard protested. "The temperature's dropping fast. Wait until morning when we can mount a proper search." "She's been out there 2 days," Owen replied, his voice hard with fear he refused to acknowledge. "Every hour matters now." Without waiting for further argument, he strode back into the night. At the livery stable, he exchanged his exhausted mount for a fresh horse, a sturdy black gelding known for its sure-footedness. He gathered supplies quickly, lanterns, ropes, extra blankets, medical supplies. As he worked, he heard footsteps behind him. You'll need help, Miller said simply, already saddling his own horse. Owen wanted to refuse, to insist on going alone, but practicality overrode emotion. Creek ravine east of town. If she was thrown, that's where she'd seek shelter. Miller nodded, Peterson's spreading the word. Others'll join the search at first light. They rode out of town, lanterns casting ghostly circles of light across the unbroken snow. The cold was brutal, each breath painful, but Owen barely noticed. His entire being was focused on finding Grace. At the creek crossing, they discovered the tracks had been obliterated by the storm. Owen dismounted, examining the area carefully. Creek's this way, he said, pointing east. Ravine deepens about a half-mile on, rock shelters, maybe caves. They proceeded slowly, the horses struggling through drifts. Every few hundred yards, Owen would stop, calling Grace's name into the darkness, the sound swallowed by the vast, indifferent night. An hour passed with no sign. Then two. The cold intensified, and even Miller, hardened by years on the frontier, began to show signs of distress. "Owen," he said reluctantly, "we need to consider." "No," Owen cut him off sharply. "She's out here. She's alive." They pressed on, following the increasingly steep ravine. Owen's calls became more frequent, more desperate. Then, as they rounded a bend where the creek narrowed between two rock faces, his lantern caught a flash of color against the snow, fabric, partially buried by a drift. There, he leapt from his horse, plunging through the snow toward what he now recognized as the edge of Grace's blue woolen cloak. Frantically, he began digging, Miller quickly joining him. The fabric led to more fabric, and then to the still form of Grace Sutton, huddled in the partial shelter of a rock overhang, nearly covered by the drifted snow. "Grace," Owen's voice broke as he brushed snow from her face. Her skin was deathly pale, her lips blue with cold, but miraculously, he could see the faint cloud of her breath in the lantern light. "She's alive," he choked out. "Miller, the blankets." Working quickly, they wrapped her in layers of wool. Then Owen gathered her into his arms, cradling her against his chest. "Grace," he called softly, his lips close to her ear. "Grace, can you hear me? It's Owen. I found you. You're safe now." For a terrible moment, there was no response. Then her eyelids fluttered, opening to reveal confused green eyes. "Owen," her voice was barely a whisper. "Are you real?" Relief crashed through him with such force he nearly sobbed. "I'm real. You're going to be all right." He looked up at Miller. "We need to get her warm, fast." "Cabin's closer than town," Miller said, pointing farther up the ravine. "Old Trapper's Place, maybe half a mile." The journey to the cabin was a blur of determination and fear. Grace drifted in and out of consciousness in Owen's arms as he rode, her body alarmingly cold against his. When the small log structure finally appeared, Owen felt a surge of desperate hope. The cabin was basic but sound, with a stone fireplace and a crude bed frame. While Miller tended to the horses, Owen laid Grace gently on the bed and set about building a fire with the dry wood stacked neatly against one wall, clear evidence that the cabin was maintained as an emergency shelter. As flames began to lick at the kindling, Owen returned to Grace. Her condition was dire, clothing soaked through, extremities dangerously cold. He knew enough about mountain survival to recognize the signs of severe exposure. "Grace," he said urgently, chafing her hands between his. "Grace, stay with me. The fire's started. We'll have you warm soon." Her eyes opened again, clearer this time. "Owen," she murmured. "You came for me." "Always," he promised, his voice rough with emotion. "Always." Miller entered, stamping snow from his boots. "Horses are settled. How is she?" "Bad," Owen replied tersely. "We need to get these wet clothes off her, get her truly warm." Miller nodded grimly. "I'll step outside, call if you need help." Once alone, Owen worked quickly, removing Grace's sodden cloak, dress, and petticoats with clinical efficiency, despite the intimacy of the act. He wrapped her in every blanket they had, then added his own coat for good measure. The fire was blazing now, filling the small cabin with blessed heat. Owen placed Grace as close to it as was safe, then knelt beside her, continuing to rub her hands and feet to restore circulation. "What happened?" he asked softly, needing to keep her conscious and talking. "Horse spooked," she managed, her voice weak but more present. "Something in the snow, fell, tried to walk back." She shivered violently. "So cold, found the rocks, waited for storm to pass." "You did right," Owen assured her. Finding shelter saved your life. Knew you'd come, she whispered, her eyes holding his with surprising clarity despite her condition. Knew you'd find me. Something shifted in Owen's chest, a final wall crumbling. This woman had trusted him with her life, had believed in him when he'd lost faith in himself. The realization was both humbling and exhilarating. I will always find you, Grace Sutton, he said, the words a vow. Always. As the night deepened, Owen maintained his vigil, coaxing Grace to sip hot broth that Miller prepared from their supplies. Gradually, color returned to her cheeks, and her shivering subsided. By dawn, though weak, she was clearly out of immediate danger. Miller left at first light to bring help from town. Owen sat beside Grace, watching the play of morning sunlight across her face, hardly daring to believe the depth of his good fortune. You're staring, she murmured, her eyes still closed. Just making sure you're still here, he replied softly. She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. Where else would I be? The simplicity of the question undid him. All the fears he'd carried, all the walls he'd built, they seemed meaningless in the face of this truth. He loved Grace Sutton, and whatever came next, he would face it with her. I went to the bank before the hunting trip, he said, taking her hand gently in his. Put a deposit on land west of town, the old Coleman place. Her eyes widened slightly. Owen, it needs work, he continued, suddenly nervous. House is sound but simple. Land's good though, plenty of water, good grazing, room to expand. It sounds wonderful, she said softly. It could be, he agreed, his thumb tracing patterns on the back of her hand, with the right person. Grace's breath caught. And who might that be? Owen met her gaze steadily, laying his heart bare at last. You, Grace, only you. He took a deep breath. I love you, have for weeks now, maybe since that first night in the moonlight. Just took me a while to admit it. Tears filled her eyes, but her smile was radiant. I've been waiting to hear those words. Sorry it took nearly losing you to say them, he said, bringing her hand to his lips. Some truths require difficult circumstances to emerge, she replied, but now that they have, she reached up to touch his face. I love you too, Owen Alderson, with all my heart. In the golden light of dawn, with the fire crackling beside them and the vast Montana wilderness stretching beyond the cabin walls, Owen leaned down and kissed her, gently at first, then with growing passion as she responded in kind. All the loneliness of his past years, all the barriers he'd constructed around his heart, dissolved in the warmth of her embrace. When they finally parted, both breathless, Owen rested his forehead against hers. When you're well enough to travel, he said, I want to show you the land, if you like it, if you can imagine building a life there. Are you asking me to marry you, Owen? Grace asked, her eyes sparkling. He laughed softly. Doing a poor job of it, aren't I? Yes, Grace Sutton, I'm asking you to be my wife, to build something lasting with me, something true. Then my answer is yes, she replied without hesitation. 1,000 times yes. 3 months later, on a clear February evening with stars blanketing the sky, Owen stood on the porch of what was now their home. The old Coleman place had been transformed through hard work and community effort. The house repaired and expanded, fields cleared for spring planting, a small herd of cattle acquired to start their operation. Behind him, through the window, he could see Grace arranging books on the shelf he'd built for her wedding present. The sight of her there in their home still filled him with wonder. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew his attention. Howard Sutton rode into the yard, dismounting with the energy of a much younger man. Evening, Owen, he called, tying his horse to the hitching post Owen had installed the previous week. Howard, Owen greeted him, extending his hand as his father-in-law of 1 month joined him on the porch. Grace will be pleased to see you. And I her, Howard replied, but it's actually you I've come to speak with. He pulled an envelope from his coat pocket. This arrived today, thought you'd want to see it straight away. Owen accepted the envelope, recognizing the government seal with a surge of anticipation. The land grant. Howard nodded, his expression pleased. Open it. With careful fingers, Owen broke the seal and unfolded the document inside. As he read, a smile spread across his face. Approved, he said, looking up at Howard with barely contained elation. The additional 300 acres to the north, it's ours. Congratulations, Howard said warmly. You're well on your way to building one of the finest spreads in the territory. The door opened behind them, and Grace appeared, her face lighting up at the sight of her uncle. Uncle Howard, what a lovely surprise. As she embraced Howard, Owen held up the document. The land grant came through, we've got the northern section. Grace's eyes widened with delight, the one with the stream. And the meadow you said would be perfect for the house we'll build when this one gets too small for our family, Owen finished, drawing her to his side. Exactly that one. Howard watched them with evident satisfaction. I'll leave you two to celebrate your good news, just wanted to deliver that personally. After Howard's departure, Owen and Grace stood together on the porch, looking out over what was now their expanded property. In the moonlight, the rolling landscape seemed to shimmer with promise. Did you ever imagine this? Grace asked, leaning against his shoulder. A year ago, I mean, that you'd have land of your own, a wife, a future so full. Owen thought back to the solitary rider he'd been, convinced that isolation was the only safe way to exist in a world of loss and disappointment. No, he admitted, never thought I'd find the courage to want something this much, to risk loving this deeply. Grace turned in his arms, looking up at him with the same directness that had first breached his defenses. And now, he said, drawing her closer, I can't imagine any other life, any other path. The moonlight bathed them in silver as Owen bent to kiss his wife, the woman whose courage and love had transformed him. As their lips met, he remembered that night months ago when she'd first truly reached him, breaking through years of carefully constructed walls. Later, as they stood in their bedroom, the moon casting long shadows through the window, Grace slipped her arms around him from behind. I'm here, she whispered against his shoulder. I'm here to love you, Owen, every day for all our days. Owen turned, gathering her in his arms, his heart full beyond measure. And I'm here to love you, Grace Alderson. Through whatever comes, whatever challenges we face, always. Outside their window, the Montana wilderness stretched vast and beautiful. No longer a place of lonely survival, but the foundation of a future built on love, trust, and the courage to believe that even in the harshest frontier, the human heart could find its home.